Jai Shri Ram. And we start today with a Mangalacharan. Om Varnanam Artha Sanghanam Rasanam Chandasamapi Mangalanam Chakartaro Vande Vani Vinayako Bhavani Shankaro Vande Shriddha Vishwasa Rupino Yabhyam Vinana Pashyanti Siddha Swantah Nisthamishwaram. And with that, I welcome Shri Vamadeva Shastri ji. We also know him as David Frawley. Sir, welcome. And Jai Shri Ram today.
Jai Shri Ram to all. Good to be with you.
And today, it's a wonderful day where the whole of India is celebrating a seminal event, an event that comes probably once in a millennium. And this has come after a struggle of nearly 500 years. So it's doubly sweet. What's your take?
Well, I have to say I was in India in December of 1992 at the time of the Babri Masjid incident. I was also in India during a number of other events relative to Ram Janmabhoomi and Ramayana. I was in Ayodhya for Diwali last fall, and I have been watching this event very closely, and I have been writing, participating, sharing my views on it all these years. So it is a wonderful day, a culmination of centuries of striving, a civilizational victory of Bharat, and a true reawakening of India. I would say this is the full intellectual, cultural, and spiritual independence of India that was promised in 1947. But there has been hesitation in delivering it. Now, Narendra Modi has been able to deliver it after all these years and after so much striving and work by so many people and groups, so many individuals that would be hard to name them all. But I do remember L.K. Advani for the work he has done in this regard over all these years, the Kar Sevaks, and the whole movement going back to Vishwa Hindu Parishad, and even more so, how the masses of India have taken this up because Ram is their symbol, Ram is their dharma, Ram Raja is the civilizational heritage of Bharat, and it's spread throughout the world, not only throughout Southeast Asia, where it's been very strong, but now everywhere. Even an hour from me, we have a Hanuman temple. So Jai Shri Ram again on this wonderful day.
That's wonderful. We have been watching you today. You were speaking on Times Now, and they asked you all sort of questions and many political questions as well. I want to go on a different tangent, and I want to discuss with you the deeper significance of Ram. As we know, that Ram is celebrated by different kind of sects in different way. Some of them treat him as the Brahma, and they do what is called the Nirguna Upasana, like Kabir and Guru Nanak. Or there are others who treat him as the Isht. The Isht is the avatar of Vishnu. And some simply treat him as a great human being, an ideal king. So my proposition to you is that the universality of Ram within every section of India and within every class of India is because of this universal kind of acceptance and this universal kind of appeal that is related to him, that is attached to him.
Yes, but I would also say that that universal background and appeal is the very foundation of the Sanatana Dharma in all the teachings, in the figure of even Sri Krishna, and all the different paths of yoga, jnana, bhakti, karma, kriya, raja, hatha, etc. Sri Ram is in all of that. So it is part of the tradition as a whole. Sri Ram, of course, is there in the great text, not only Ramayana of Valmiki and Tulsidas, but also in the Yoga Vasishta, one of the great works on Advaita Vedanta and Raja Yoga, the Adhyatma Ramayana, which is also an Advaitic work, and the chanting of the name of Ram is perhaps the most commonly chanted name in the Bhakti tradition. And in the tradition of Bharat and Sanatana Dharma, there is no contradiction between Saguna and Nirguna, between Bhakti, Jnana. All these things have their place. They are integrated. They are necessary in the full universality. And ultimately, Sri Ram dwells in all of us as our true self, as Ishwara, however you want to look at it. But we hold that very broad, open view. And that is why the entire universe belongs to Sri Ram. In fact, the whole story is full with cosmological, mystical, as well as dharmic symbolism for humanity.
You're right. These deep symbolisms actually are very often quite mysterious for people to understand. So I would like you to dwell on some of these symbolisms so that people do understand the deeper meanings that go behind the symbolisms.
Well, let me start out with this one point. Sri Ram is, of course, connected to the sun, Surya, and he's in the solar dynasty, the Surya Vamsha. And he also does the chant of Aditya Hridaya, which he received from the Rishi Agastya, in order to defeat Ravan in the battle in Sri Lanka. So he is the solar power, Paramatma, all of that. Whereas Sita Devi is the earth. She is Bhumi Devi, she is Lakshmi, she is Ayonija, she is born of the Sita, which means a furrow in the ground. When the king Janaka, who was also a great enlightened sage, was doing his annual plowing of the fields. So heaven and earth, sun and earth, Sita and Ram. But also Lord Hanuman is Vayu Putra. He is the son of the wind. He is the power of Antariksha. He is an Amsha of Lord Shiva. He is the supreme prana over all. So Sita, Ram, Hanuman are the three worlds. They are the three powers. They are the triple law. They are integrated. They are the powers of sadhana. They permeate the universe. And so all these levels must be recognized and understood, and they will appeal in different ways to different people. But that background cosmological view we find all the way going back to the Vedas. And I would also mention that the Gautama family were the Purohits of Videha, in which Vamadeva was occurred. And the Vasishtas were the Purohits of Kosala, where there was Sri Ram. And Vishwamitra was the guru in terms of the martial arts, Dhanurveda for Sri Ram. So all the rishis are also there.
You mentioned Yoga Vasishta also. Yoga Vasishta is one of the lesser known or less popular texts with the people, though it is said that it is one of the deepest texts. And in fact, I remember Dr. Subhash Kak, he keeps mentioning that it is the greatest novel ever written. So can you tell our viewers a little bit about Yoga Vasishta and how that relates to the story of Sri Ramachandra ji?
Well, the important thing about Yoga Vasishta, it is the ultimate classic of yoga and Vedanta. All aspects of Hatha Yoga, but even Bhakti, Kriya, Karma, Prana, Mantra, all the secrets of their chakras, Kundalini, all of that, with the great secrets of the Advaita Vedanta, the self-inquiry, the self-examination, and all the overall deeper teachings. So this must be borne in mind. And it is a very long text. It's huge. I mean, thousands of pages, shlokas, ultimately. And even more so, it goes into depth in every subject. The dialogue is mainly between Vasishtha teaching Lord Ram asking questions, but it has many stories within stories, dreams within dreams, worlds within worlds. Anything in science fiction you can discover there as well. Telepathy, moving through other bodies, going beyond birth and death. All these factors are there in the Yoga Vasishtha. It is my favorite text in many ways. There are many good commentaries on it, shorter versions of it, translations. There's the Laghu Yoga Vasishtha as well. So I would say it is the ultimate classic of the yoga and Advaita Vedanta. And it is also a huge explanation so that everything is covered there. And we would ask all the viewers to read it and study it more from any point. It's a huge text. Open it anywhere, go to any story, and it will enlighten you at every level of your consciousness.
That's a great suggestion. I would also recommend to viewers that please do read Yoga Vasishtha if you want to go deeper into the Rama story. And we know Rama as a Maryada Purushottam, but he was also a great yogi. So if you want to discover Bhagavan Ram as the great yogi, then you have to go to Yoga Vasishtha. Now coming to the situation regarding the celebration of the Ram movement, we know that it is a very joyous day for almost all Indians, bar a few. Now, we have come to expect that there will be complete lack of grace from the part of this cabal, which is the liberal, or rather, they should actually be called illiberals, and the Marxists and the Islamists, of course. But today, I think, or rather yesterday, they did go a little beyond all norms by saying that, in fact, All India Muslim Personal Law Board came out with a statement that said that, the judgment was shameful, short of saying disgraceful. They said everything about the judgment, and they said it was appeasing the minority. Basically, it was scandalous. The statement was scandalizing the Supreme Court, and its contempt of court is clearly minor. But that apart, the sheer arrogance and reference to Hagia Sophia in that statement, I think it seems to prove whatever we have been saying about the supremacism and the Abrahamic hate that has actuated the Islamic rule in India over the 500, 600 years that they lasted. Basically, I take it from the slave dynasty. It's from the Muhammad Ghori up to the decline of Aurangzeb at about 1680 or 1690 or so. So this 500 period of heydays of Islamic rule in India was full of savagery, full of bigotry, full of perversions, things like sex slavery, all these things, I think we know that. And there has been an attempt to whitewash all this. But this statement that came yesterday, it seems to justify everything that the adversaries of this whitewashing project have been saying, people like you and me.
Yes, definitely the case. Just a quick point about the 500 years. Don't forget the Vijayanagar. And the Muslims didn't get into the south until the early 14th century. And tremendous resistance was there that did push them back. And also the Rajputs fought, and they defeated the Khilji dynasty after a certain point. Mughals came a little bit later. So the point is the Hindus did continue fighting. But as you said, tremendous destruction of universities, of temples, slavery. I think in many ways the Delhi Sultanate was the worst, but I think Aurangzeb also brought the Delhi Sultanate mentality back. So that was a very dark spot on the history of India and also on human history over all, the destruction of Nalanda, so many things. Aurangzeb destroying Kashi Vishwanath, as is well known, or the Krishna Janmabhoomi as well. That history is there. Now, relative to the Hagia Sophia, that was the chief or most important church in the Byzantine or Eastern Roman Empire for 1,000 years or more before it was turned into a mosque after the Turkish armies overran Constantinople in 1452. It was only in the early 20th century that Kemal Ataturk, who aimed at secularizing in the positive sense and removing the Islamic rule. Turkey had been the caliphate prior to that. He tried to create it into a modern state, more of a democracy, all of that. So he removed the mosques and except into the sidelight, made it more into a museum, allowed the church to be there. But now, in the 21st century, Erdogan, the new caliphate ruler, would be emperor of Islam, you might say, has removed that church and made it into a mosque again. So it's not just a question of a mosque that had been turned into a church. It was the other way around, and there was no destruction originally of the church. On the other hand, with Ram Janmabhoomi, we know very well that the temple was there, the temple was destroyed. It was destroyed mainly on political grounds, because to rule a vast country like India, to destroy its cultural icon, ideal king, dharmic ruler, Sri Ram in his place of birth, had a great political message and political power via rulership. So that, of course, did go on. So today, to endorse Hagia Sophia and to go against Ram Janmabhoomi shows a very one-sided view that sacred sites of another religion other than Islam cannot be taken back, even if they have been turned into a mosque, or even they've been destroyed and made into a mosque. And what I can say for that is we can regard holy sites of different religions as sacred, okay, but we have to honor all of them. And in this regard, there are many sacred sites, not only of the Hindus, but also Buddhist, Native traditions, Native Americans, pagan shrines, Native Africans, people, Polynesian, all of that, which have been destroyed largely in the colonial era, which were largely replaced by other religious sites, mainly for conversion purposes. So I think we have to honor overall the ability of these other spiritual traditions of humanity to have their sacred sites and to reclaim at least a few of them. And this reclamation of Ayodhya and Ram Janmabhoomi is the beginning of this process. We need to honor the spiritual heritage of all humanity, not just a few exclusive faiths, and allow all the native peoples, all the dharmic traditions to have the respect for their sites and their teachings, which are still denigrated, which are still suppressed. And we must remember that China destroyed most of the Buddhist shrines in China. I was there in the 80s and saw when they were just beginning their reconstruction. They had subordinated that. And the largest number of mosques in the history of the world were destroyed by Joseph Stalin in Central Asia. So the Marxists don't have much of the history of any type of religious liberalism. Of course, they will play one enemy against another for a certain period of time. And I'll have to say the Shias in India have supported Ram Janmabhoomi, and at least a number of them have, and other sacred sites coming back. And I have to also tell the Muslims very clearly that almost every traditional mosque in Saudi Arabia has been removed by the government of Saudi Arabia, because the Wahhabi tradition does not worship mosques. It believes the mosques are temporary shelters or places of worship and should not be worshipped themselves. They're almost all gone. In fact, even I think it was Prince Charles of UK, Great Britain, who appealed to the Saudis to save some of these ancient heritages and mosques, including many of them that were built by the Turks during the period of Turkish rule. The Saudis were also quite against the Turks and are still struggling with them today. So let's put this into perspective. And the perspective is not accepting Ram Janmabhoomi does not show any liberalism of any type or any type of religious tolerance or respect for anyone. And it also doesn't really reflect what has gone on in the Islamic world entirely. But I have to say that the Muslims of Pakistan and to a certain extent India seem to be more intolerant than those in the other parts of the world, and certainly not willing to honor the fact that their ancestors were Hindus, which at least is being done in Indonesia.
Yes, we have this curious spectacle of Pakistan not even allowing a temple to go up and opposing a court-ordained construction of the Ram Mandir in India. So, of course, but Pakistan is Pakistan. We know their hypocrisy and we know their master faith syndrome. But I'm really surprised at the way some of the reaction in the West has happened, including some people really, again, calling Indians intolerant. Of course, I know right now the West is also almost overtaken by this Marxist theology. I call Marxism a theology, exactly like the Abrahamic theologies. So the three theologies, especially the two theologies, the Islamic theology and the Marxist theology, seems to be acting together in the West. And we can see that in the way it is happening in the Black Lives Matter movement, where even the Christian churches are being attacked. And that is exactly the kind of theology that seems to be attacking the Indian temples, the Indian tradition. And today you must have seen Atish Tasir making a very, very bad tweet, a very bad taste, and opposing even the Ram temple being celebrated on the Times Square. And it's not just Atish Tasir. Of course, we know that Atish Tasir is a personally respected person. But even otherwise, the general noise that is coming from the West, especially the United States, has been quite anti-Hindu.
Well, let me make a few points here. First of all, we do know in the Indian context that the Congress Party, who was responsible for the delay in the building of the Ram Mandir, which was stopped by Nehru, is at least supporting that today. I haven't seen the West attacking them yet, but I suppose that might be possible in the long term, although they may accept it as a political maneuver short term, which it very well may be. And secondly, we must remember that you mainly see the leftist media coming out of the West today. Going back to Babri Masjid, I can tell you as a stated fact, I read it in the newspaper in December 1992, that the New York Times criticized the Indians for destroying Babri Masjid, which they quote unquote called the oldest mosque in India, which is of course totally untrue. It was built in the 16th century, and Islamic influence began even in the 8th century as traders and all of that. And the New York Times also once had an article where they referred to the Amarnath Yatra as Hindus going to literally, and again quote, worship the sex organs of Lord Shiva, the god of destruction. So this is the type of rhetoric that's been coming out of the so-called liberal leftist media in America. And the far left, I would say, has taken these over. Even recently, one of the main opinion directors for the New York Times resigned because of the intolerance she was seeing. And I've even heard other journalists who are older senior journalists from the left saying that the left in America has gone off the deep end and has lost any credibility as an objective voice. So that these groups are saying that is something that I wouldn't entirely, I would expect. And unfortunately, the Democratic Party, whom the Hindus have largely supported over the years, has been supporting Islam and Pakistan and promoting anti-Hindu views. So this has been a problem, even though the Hindus in America are the most affluent and educated of the minority communities and have caused no trouble for anyone. And I would also like to compare this to the situation in UK, where in the last election, the Hindus voted against the Tories, who they had supported in the past because of their anti-Hindu attitudes. So I think a greater Hindu political voice will help counter this in the United States. And also we need to challenge that distorted media. And unfortunately, many of these leftist views in America, they take their orders and their instructions directly from the same leftist media in India. So the media in India also has to change. It is changing to some degree, but these are some of the challenges that continue that need to be addressed so that the true heritage of Bharat and Sri Ram can be properly represented in this information technology and global media.
In this context, we have a peculiar brand of secularism that obtains in India. How do you think that can be corrected? You think that this construction of Ram Temple will have an impact?
Well, the idea of Indian secularism is to take the majority religion, which in this case is the Hindu Dharma, and restrict it legally, interfere with its practices, and even in this case for some years, not allow the rebuilding even of its most important sacred sites. India is the only country in the world that taxes, the state government's taxing or taking resources from the majority religion and its temples and using them for public or mundane and other purposes. It's the only country in the world in which the courts interfere with or make judgments on the rituals and practices of the majority religion. And of course, this is not done with any of the other religions in India. They are allowed to be freed. So there's this strange attitude that anything Hindu is a public resource for everyone to use and even disrespect. It's not even sacred. Where at the same time, Christianity and Islam, which are exclusive beliefs trying to convert the Hindus, should be honored as true religions, you might say, and not interfered with. So that secularism of India has to be removed. It is not a true secularism, and no other country in the world has the term secularism, I think, in their constitution, and very rarely socialism, and these, of course, came out during the emergency, which was the dictatorial era. So now the secular forces have been defeated on their main iconic issue, the Ram Janmabhoomi. A number of them, like the Congress Party, at least superficially, has tried to leave some of these contentious issues and appeal more to a Bharatiya or even Hindu audience. But we must continue with this battle, and we must continue recognizing that the Hindu Dharma is still distorted throughout the world. It's still looked with the colonial eyes, but now the Marxists are carrying on the colonial denigrations of India and also willing to ally themselves with conversion-based forces. So that struggle is still there, and we must be very vigilant for the future. Short term, they will make more noise because they have lost a key battle. Jai Shri Ram.
Jai Shri Ram. But my question was whether the Hindus will gain their self-confidence because of this reconstruction happening. Because I think because of all the obstructions that were going on, people were not confident even till about 1 month back that this kind of thing can happen. They were always apprehensive that, well, something at the last moment will crop up, something will happen, and this is not going to take place, because they had that deep sense of inferiority and the deep sense of self-reproach that has been continuing for almost 150 years. My question that I had asked particularly, whether this changes the psychology, will this have, or let me put it another way, is this likely to have an impact on the attitudes of the Hindus, which have been largely defensive, diffident, almost bordering on being apologetic, and sometimes, as it has been said, almost bordering on self-reproach. Do you think that this kind of a seminal event will affect or is likely to affect the psychology of the Hindus? Will they be more upfront?
Well, I've been addressing, of course, this issue for many years. I remember in India 30 years ago, if you were to ask a person, are you a Hindu? They might say, I'm a Hindu, but I accept all other religions as well. Or they would say, my family is Hindu, or something like that. We didn't see much pride in Hindus. And we also never saw political leaders willing to say they were Hindus. Now, since Narendra Modi was elected, some 5-6 years ago, there has been a change, and to be a Hindu has become more positive and has had some political and social value that it didn't have in the past. But there's still a lack of self-confidence, an unwillingness to challenge the media, to change the textbooks, and to stand up for equal rights. It's not a question that the Hindus are asking to be, they said, oh, Hindus are being majoritarian. No, they're asking for equal rights. In fact, the Muslims and Christians are not being interfered with by the courts and the state governments the way the Hindus are. The Hindu views are still distorted in the textbooks, and the media is still putting out distortions. For example, these Delhi riots, which were clearly orchestrated now by anti-Hindu forces, as soon as they began, the media immediately blamed the Hindus for them. And that blaming of the Hindus for starting the riots went immediately to the Western media, New York Times, Washington Post, who posted it as a fact when it was only an allegation in a case that had not even been studied or litigated or even gone over. And today you're not going to see any apology from the media for having put out these false views. So the media assault on them has made Hindus lose their confidence or not have the confidence they should have. So that confidence and fearlessness should be there. That is what Sri Ram represented. That is what Hanuman, even Sita, represented. So that must come out. And the fact is, if you bring it out, then the issues will be finished. Just like the Ram Janmabhoomi, not making a decisive stand, kept it going for 70 years. There are many other issues that are like that. They're still going, the textbooks, it's still 70 years, haven't changed properly. But if you make that decisive change, then it is finished and you will move on and your enemies stand defeated. Otherwise, you're holding on in the battlefield. So that new confidence should come up. I think it is there in leaders like Narendra Modi and the Ram Janmabhoomi movement. Many young people are taking it up. We have many good young writers and authors and thinkers that you have interviewed. So that change is coming up, but it still needs to be stronger. And this victory will make a difference. And it should also be taken forward and not just simply said, now we've had enough or our views are honored. No, one major victory is won, but there are still media, foreign policy, foreign views, issues of conversion going on. All of these need to be addressed and do require confidence, fearlessness. Certainly, they require compassion and truthfulness, but they do require that sometimes you do take a stand, and whether it's Ravana or Kurukshetra, the Kshatriya, the warrior has to be honored, just like Shivaji and Samartha Ramdas.
Yes, indeed. I think you were the first person to use that term, intellectual Kshatriyas. Viewers, I would request you to keep asking questions on the super chat, because uh, it is time that you start asking questions as we move on. And now I ask another question to you, sir. That is, there is a problem that we find with the Indians, especially, and that is when they come across the West. The West is unable to grasp the Indian traditions, the many path paradigm of the Indian traditions, where you can have the same deity, the same deities. Take, for instance, Bhagwan Ram. He can be approached through bhakti and through the medium of manas. He can be approached through jnana, through the medium of buddhi, and he can approach through the higher consciousness, through yoga, and through the medium of chit. So those who are schooled in the Indian traditions, they understand this. But the general population somehow doesn't understand this. And when the attack occurs, Wendy Doniger-like attack occurs, or Retrushke-like attack occurs, then a lot of the responses are found wanting. How do we school our people in this kind of a system? Because I've been trying to do that. I try to distinguish this many paths kind of a situation with the misleading stories that are built around ahimsa paramo dharma, vasudhaiva kutumbakam, and ekam sat vipra bahudha vadanti. Our own traditions are told to us in a way to make us defensive. So shall we devise, or do we have some kind of a defense mechanism against this kind of a perverse attack that is launched on us?
Well, that has been addressed by many Hindu thinkers, Vivekananda, Ramatirtha, Swami Chinmayananda, both Dayananda of Arsha Vidya and also Dayananda of Arya Samaj. It has been addressed by the gurus in a very significant way. Sri Aurobindo extensively is another good example of that, and many writing in the local dialects, languages, Sanskrit, all of that, but it hasn't gotten so much into media and textbooks. And let me speak as someone who was born and educated in the West and turned to the Vedic and Dharmic traditions at a young age. In Western psychology, for example, which Wendy Doniger follows, Freudian view, they believe that the body is the only reality. They believe that there's no consciousness beyond the brain. And they interpret psychology, and through psychology, politics and philosophy and religion purely in terms of biological and social functions, at most economic. Sometimes we say the anecdote that in there's 7 chakras in the yoga system, but in the Western psychology, there's at most 1 or 2, and even these aren't understood properly. And in education, the Western education does not look beyond what I would call the Rajasic Buddhi, the ego-based intellect, which is also trapped in an external view of reality, basically in physical view of self and physical view of human being, and even physical view of history. You have to have a skeleton somewhere to make them believe somebody actually lived there. Whereas in the yoga traditions and all the dharmic traditions, there is an understanding of consciousness and states of consciousness beyond the mind, subtle lokas, realms of meditation, realms of cosmic creation, dhyana lokas, deva lokas, and ultimately this paramatma, pure consciousness. And in Vedanta, we learn that your true self is not the body or the mind. Your true existence is not just this physical life. You are one with the Paramatma, the Supreme Self, which can be approached by any names, any number of names and forms, Sri Ram, Sri Krishna, Lord Shiva, Durga, Sundari, so many. The cosmic or universal or transcendent reality is understood in the Dharmic traditions, where it's not understood in the West. But even in the West, the physicists have been borrowing from the yoga, Vedanta, Buddhist traditions. The healers, the psychologists have tried to bring in some mantra and mindfulness. Alternative medicine has brought in aspects of the Ayurveda. So a lot of the cutting edge of Western thought has been looking to the Indic traditions, while the political side of Western thought is still caught up in the materialism of Marxism. And a lot of the Western religions are still caught up in the need to conquer or convert the world to an exclusive belief, which is Rajoguna. It's not Sattva-guna. It's hardly nowhere near the Paramatma. So it's very important that the Hindu thinkers need to understand the Shastra and also what is going on in the world today, and understand the background and weaknesses of their opponents. Freud was not one who understood human consciousness at all. He was mainly studying incest among wealthy families in Vienna. That's where he came to his view of the mind. Jung brought in a little bit of teachings from the East, but backed away from them at a certain point, even after he had honored them. And figures like Wendy Doniger are using Freud and Marx, both materialists, to understand a Dharmic tradition. And none of these academics have ever done any sadhana. They've never chanted Om. I don't think they've been to a Hindu temple. They certainly wouldn't honor a Hindu guru. And they don't study the teachings beyond the political, economic, or social ramifications. So there needs to be an intellectual challenge to them. It is there, and it needs to be brought out more, and it needs to be shared and learned. Everybody in India should know the basics of yoga and Vedanta. Not so difficult, but certainly all the Hindus should know that. And they should be able to teach that to anyone who says Hindus are this or Hindus are that, or we want to convert you, or you're politically biased and we're liberal. I think the Marxists have destroyed or killed more people and destroyed more cultures than anyone else in the world. And if they came to power in India, they would do a cultural revolution in India also and remove as many temples and shastras as they could. Fortunately, they failed, but their venom is still there in their minds and willing to go into the media.
Yes, indeed. The venom is still there in the mind, and you can see that in the Naxal-dominated areas in the forests of Chhattisgarh and Andhra Pradesh, or rather Telangana now, that tri-junction, with Orissa also coming in over there. And wherever they dominate, they try and destroy cultures. That's been something that thread runs common to them throughout the world. You mentioned about Freud and Jung. We know that Freud and Jung, they only accepted 3 levels of psychic, you would call them consciousness, or 3 psychic levels. That is Vakari, Madhyama, and Pashyanti. And the 4th and the most important aspect, which is accepted in the Indian tradition, that is of Para, the consciousness related with Chitta. That is completely denied by the West. And I'm told that even though Jung came to the conclusion that there is a good reason to honor the para level, the parapsychic level, but then he was so much under the influence of the Christian church that his discussions with Christian church, he was dissuaded from doing that. Can you enlighten us on that aspect?
Yes, well, I'll actually have to make a little clarification here. They never reached Pashyanti, and they hardly reached Madhyama. They were mainly on Vaikari. And again, they only accepted that consciousness and mind were functions of the brain. That is Freud. He did not accept anything beyond the brain and the physical life. And he tried to interpret everything according to what he called the unconscious, which was basically sexual urges, traumas, etc., from childhood. Jung did accept what he called the collective unconscious, but it wasn't really a spiritual awareness or paramatma or even mahat tattva. It was kind of of taking the Freudian view of the unconscious and making it a little bit broader, and accepting that there were certain positive forces he called archetypes working there that we could use to help us reach a higher state of individual being. At certain early times in his lives, he did use terms like Shiva and Shakti. He did seem to embrace karma, rebirth, all of that. But later on in his life, he kept his distance. I know the Germans gave him quite a bit of trouble, and you have to honor him for going against Hitler and challenging all of that. But he never really fully embraced, and as he went into his older years, he never went beyond the idea of the collective unconscious, as we say, which doesn't even reach the level of the Mahatattva. It's sort of on a Madhyama level. Pashanti implies seeing, where seeing and knowing and mantra is one. And para is transcendent. Western religions don't have para. They don't have paramatma. Pashanti they might touch upon, but they don't really understand that. Artists can enter into Madhyama to some degree by way of inspiration, but that overall understanding of higher levels of speech and consciousness is not there in the Western thought. And so they try to understand everything in the Dharmic traditions according to Vaikari, which is name and form, politics, desire in the material world. And that's why they haven't gone very far. And that's why now the West is being almost totally taken over by a drug-based medicine. And even now the Freudian and the Jungians have been pushed in the sidelight. And now the idea is that consciousness is nothing more than a chemical function of the brain. To feel better in mind and consciousness will give you a different drug. Unfortunately, the drug has side effects and may cause other problems. But that whole lack of understanding of higher consciousness has now caused a lot of trouble in Western psychology and psychiatry. And unfortunately, the higher views of consciousness that we find in physics emerging in the West, we don't really see them very much in biology or psychology, although that I should mention that there are some psychologists who are bringing in mindfulness and mantra into their practice, but more as a practical tool than as necessarily an embracing of all the philosophies involved.
That's wonderfully explained, viewers. This was something that was very important, and I brought it out especially because there are not very many people who can explain this well. And I once again urge you to keep asking questions. I think till now I have only one or two questions. And it's important that you ask questions to such a knowledgeable person we have. You don't always get him here. Also, please like, subscribe, and share, and also support us with donations. With your grace, with your contributions, we are now into a reasonable studio, and we'll be bringing you many such shows over and over again. Sir, now I ask you another question. And that is regarding this little attempt to create division between the Buddhist traditions and the Indian traditions, and an attempt to show as if Gautam the Buddha was a rebel, a social rebel, not an evolutionary sage, bringing in a different interpretation of the states of consciousness, but as if he was kind of a social revolutionary. And a lot of attempt, of course, is being done by the Marxists. Suddenly the Marxists are turning Buddhist. I think they have realized that they are not having much headway with Islam or Christianity, because their basic elements are different. But Buddhism coming from the same tradition, they seem to feel that they will have a better chance with that. So can you dilate on this subject a little bit? Whether there is any essential difference on the fundamentals of time concepts, of logic concepts, of cosmology and others, or there's only a superficial difference?
Well, it's a vast subject, and I'll try to address it from certain angles. First of all, Dalai Lama said Hindus and Buddhists are like twin brothers, and they should fully respect one another. And the same Marxists are quite happy to see Tibet and Tibetan Buddhism destroyed and Dalai Lama denigrated. I also, a few years ago, had a discussion with Lama Semten, who is one of their main teachers of Sarnath school and also connected to Dalai Lama. And he made the very interesting point. He said all Dharmic traditions share the same Dharmic values. They have different philosophies, and they honor differences in philosophy. But all of the Dharmic philosophies take us to samadhi, or direct realization, perception, direct experience through meditation, beyond concepts, names, and forms, as the ultimate pramana, or discovery of truth. So in that samadhi pramana, there is a certain oneness, just as there is a oneness of dharmic values, yamas, niyamas, all of that. So that is certainly there. Going back to the figure of Lord Buddha, he proudly called his tradition Arya Dharma. He used the Arya term many times. He used many common dharmic terms, dharma, karma, chitta, dhyana, all mantra. In fact, if you look at the Mahayana, Vajrayana traditions, for example, as the Tibetans follow, they have pujas, abhishekas, they use Ayurveda, they use Jyotish, they use Sanskrit mantras. And we must also recognize that both Buddhist and also Hindu and all the traditions of Bharat had tremendous philosophical diversity, whether it's Dvaita and Advaitic traditions in the Hindu traditions, whether it's the four Buddhist schools, which also had very fierce debates among them, and different Jain, Sikh, all these groups. So diversity of philosophy is no problem because the human mind is different. There is a unity of consciousness, but body, mind have their time, space differences. So Lord Buddha's teachings, also in Dhammapada, he talks about the importance of the Brahman and the qualities of the Brahman. The importance of the Dharma Kula or the Dharma family, the Satsanga. So some differences of practice, some differences of techniques, philosophies are there, but the Dharmic traditions are one. And even in Zen Buddhism, you find terms like self-nature of the mind. And I sometimes make it into a very simple formula. You have this concept of Atma versus Anatma, as if the Buddhists were rejecting the Atma, Paramatma, and the Hindus were somehow misled by the Atma concept. What Lord Buddha said, he says, there is no self in anything. That means in Hindu thought, the self, the Atma, is not in anything. When he says the Atma is not in the body, it's not in the skandhas, it's not in the senses, it's not in all these outer things, the Hindus would certainly agree. The Atma is in its own nature. And even the Buddhists eventually talk about the self-nature of the Bodhi mind. They talk about one consciousness, or they talk about voidness. In fact, they use the mantra Om to indicate the shunyata, or the voidness. And also the voidness, Om is also Akasha, space, Brahman, Kam, Brahma, as in Upanishads. And the Buddhists then associate Om with Sukha, which for them is also Ananda. So there are many common correlations, but I believe most firmly we have to allow for philosophical differences because the minds of people are different. Languages change, words gain different meanings. Atma has a number of meanings in Hindu thought. Yoga has many meanings in Hindu thought. So India is not based upon that kind of, what I call this kind of a semantic dictatorialness or semantic divisiveness, where one word like Jesus becomes this, And if you don't accept that word, then you are to be rejected. So we welcome that philosophical abundance, and there should be an open tradition of debate. But this tradition is based on sadhana and on dhyana to find the truth, not simply reading political tracts and not simply making judgments from the rajasic buddhi, the ahankara, the egoistic mind that wants to put the time, space, limited personality as the sole determination of truth when it's caught simply in its personal opinions. So yes, let's honor these traditions in their fullness. Let's let them share, but let's go back to the traditional teachings and teachers, not to those academics who are trying to politicize them for their own political views. Jai Shri Ram.
Also, Buddha is appeared to have, Gautam the Buddha appeared to have said that he is a successor of Rama Pandita, as called him. One of the sutras, I don't remember which one. And he said that his father Shuddhodhan was actually Dasharatha, and his disciple Ananda was Hanuman. That also occurs in one of the Buddhist scriptures.
Yes, in fact, the Buddhists recognized Sri Ram as a Pratyeka Buddha. And they also recognized, as you said, they had what they call the Jatakas, which explain some of these stories of previous lives of Lord Buddha. And Ashwagosha, who wrote the Buddha Charita, said the greatest Kavya work was the Valmiki's Ramayana. So that tradition was there. And of course, we have the Ramayana in the Buddhist countries, as well as the Hindu countries, and the harmony between the traditions, even allowing different views to exist at various levels.
Thank you very much. Now, I think we've got a few questions. I think we got one question till now. So we'll take that question. This is from Shankar Kumar Chatterjee. So does the hostility of the West to Hinduism have its roots in their inferiority to us in the science of consciousness?
Yes, I would say to some degree that is true. That when they see the massive science of consciousness in yoga, Vedanta, Buddhist, Jain texts, and so forth, it is intimidating to them, particularly those who are in fields of philosophy or religion. That's why the missionaries will only talk about Hinduism in terms of things like caste. At a level of philosophy, they really cannot challenge that at all. And then the scientists also are a bit intimidated by these dharmic traditions and consciousness, even though at other levels they find them to be of interest. But I would say this is part of a bigger issue in that confronted with India, India is a much vaster and older civilization overall. Its bounty in terms of music, art, medicine, philosophy, logic, sculpture, temples, its cosmology of many lokas, multi-billions of years. These shadow over Western thought, whether the religious thought, the scientific thought has come up a bit, but in the 19th century, it totally dwarfed it, so that there was this sense of a great cultural challenge that India has to make to Western civilization. And not only Western civilization in its mainstream science and technology form, but also in its religious forms. Now we have Western religious groups now trying to bring in meditation, mantra, yoga, things that they would never talk about in the past because they've had to see the power of these things. So there is a civilizational confrontation going on. And the West feels intimidated by the dharmic traditions and specifically India. And at another level, they don't understand. So they try to use Western terms like theology, Western view of science, Western understanding of mind, brain, cosmology, all these things that are inappropriate for the Dharmic traditions. And that's one way, one of the main ways that they distort these. So this civilizational side of Bharat must be brought out. And that's been my main concern, is that we bring out and share these deeper teachings, Yoga, Vedanta, Ayurveda, understanding of time, space, cosmology, because these go far beyond science fiction, modern science, and a universal view that the West is moving towards. And that is one of the reasons there's a attempt to always downsize India and say, oh, but what about caste? Or, but what about the fact that you haven't done well with technology? And just to tell you an anecdote here, years ago in UK, they always said, the problem is the Hindus are too poor. Now, recently, they've come to saying the problem is that Hindus have too much money. So you see, whatever you do at a certain level may be rejected, but it is the civilizational challenge. But we have to remember very clearly, it is to the best interest of humanity that we embrace the Dharmic traditions, the spiritual traditions of the world, but particularly the Dharmic traditions, which have preserved themselves better, because these alone give us the higher intelligence and consciousness that is necessary to master and use our information technology in a positive way. If we don't have a higher awareness beyond body and brain, then definitely we will end up ruled by artificial intelligence and the machine, rather than using our technology to free us from the burdens of the material world so we can explore higher consciousness, the universe as a whole, not only on the outside, but also within us.
I think I'll just supplement this question with an observation of mine, this lack of understanding in the West of the Indian traditions and the way India is to be looked at. I think it is best reflected in the Western translations of the Vedas. And I think I read an article by Professor Kark again about how they translate the first Rigveda Richa, Om Agni Mile Purohitam Yagyasya Devasya Rityajam Hotaram Ratnat, where Agni becomes the sacrificial fire and Devatas become physical Devatas, and that kind of a thing. I think with your kind of understanding of the Vedas, I think you could just explain this also to the viewers. And the viewers don't understand how this distorts perspectives.
Yes, in my 20s, I spent 5 hours a day studying Rig Veda in the original Sanskrit. And I eventually translated about 200 of the suktas. Recently, I did a book called Vedic Yoga, The Path of the Rishis, which is available in India, which also explains the Adhyatmic Paramatma meaning of the Vedic suktas and how the Vedic rishis, Vishwamitra, Vamadeva, Vasishta, etc., were all great Mahayogis and Advaitic masters. So let us begin with Agni. Vedas say there are 4 levels of speech, or even 7 levels of speech, but even more than that. Vak is universal. Vak is cosmic mind. So let's talk about Agni. The Western mind only sees the primitive fire of making offerings, and as if the people were so unaware that they felt if they didn't make offerings to the sacred fire, the sun wouldn't rise in the morning, or the days would not get shorter or longer through the year. So let us look at Agni. I always say that to understand the Vedas, you have to understand the Devatas. And to understand the Devatas, you have to understand their different levels. So let us begin. At a physical level, we have the Jatar Agni, or the digestive fire, which is the key factors in the Ayurvedic medicine and understanding the physical body. And then we have the Prana Agni, the Agni of Prana, which begins with the Agni of the breath that we use in pranayama, but goes into yet deeper levels of prana, even extending into the immortal prana. We also have Agni in the senses as the eyes, but we not only have an outer eye for seeing the external world, we also have an inner eye for seeing the internal world. And at the level of the mind, we have Agni as buddhi, vijnana, Vijnanamaya Kosha, which is the ability of viveka to discern the truth from the false, being from non-being, eternal from the transient, self from not self. Tamasoma Jyotir Gamaya is not about turning my skin from a darker skin to a lighter skin. It's about going beyond the ignorance of the outer mind and senses to the inner light of Paramatma. And so far, Western philosophy, psychology, and religion has not gotten there, although it may have had some glimpses on that. So Agni then is the Chid Agni, the power of consciousness, which is immortal and eternal. And even beyond that, Agni is Sad Agni, Brahm Agni, the immortal, eternal flame of pure existence. There's also the Agni that is Ananda. And besides the outer yajna, the outer sacrifice, you could call it, or havan, there's the antar yaga, in which we make offerings to the Agni within us, who is the Jivatma at the level of the heart, and behind that, the Paramatma. And if you look at the 4th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, they also discuss these antar yagas, which are yoga, which are pranayama, which are pratyahara, which are dhyana. So the Vedic yajna was always inner and outer, and the antar yaga was always yoga and meditation. And that is why Agni is also said to be immortal, eternal, infinite, cosmic light, etc. In fact, they say Janma Janma Nihita Jataveda. Jataveda is a name for Agni, but is the one who knows births. He's hidden in every birth. He is your individual Atma who is connected to the Paramatma. So if we understand the Devata, then we know that the Vedic Sukta is on all these levels of Agni. Vak is also Agni. Mantra is also Agni. But ultimately, Paramatma is Agni. Agni in the material world, outer world of nature is called Agni. Agni in the atmosphere, the pranic realm, is Jatavedas, which is also the Jivatma. Agni in the heaven is the sun, but that's also the Vaishwanara, which is the Paramatma. We find these teachings reflected in Upanishads also, where we can uncover the deeper Vedic symbolism. Sri Aurobindo wrote about that. Kavyakanta, Ganapati Muni, Sri Anirvan, Swami, so many others. I won't go into all of them, but I have mentioned them here and there in my work. So understand Agni. Soma is Ananda and Samadhi. Soma is not a drink. The highest Soma is Satchidananda. So we don't have time for all the Devatas, but all the Devatas have that. And Indra as prana is the supreme prana, the immortal prana that is Lord Shiva, not just simply the breath or the wind. So I have to say, the Western academic scholars, if I were to grade them for their understanding of Vedic text on 0 to 100, I couldn't give them more than 10. Many would be at the level of 1, and a lot would be in the negative realm, because their views are not only misleading, or they have not only understood the teachings, they've given a totally false and denigrating, inappropriate view that tells us more about their personal and cultural prejudices than anything Vedic.
Well, talking to you, Vamadevji, is a Jnana Yagya as well. So that is also, we are playing with a different kind of fire here. So we got 2 more questions, so that we'll take. This is Nakul Gote. This after World War II, Nazis were weaned off Nazism over many decades, not just by prosecuting some war criminals, but by exposing them to the deeds and ideological fallacies. Something similar for Muslims, can it be done?
Well, I think it's very important that we have the correct view of history. We have a correct view of teachings and traditions and theology. At the same time, we have to recognize that in the case of Islam, there are many Islamic countries, many Islamic sects, And so we should be specific in terms of what we are bringing forth. But certainly what the Islamic rule did to the countries they invaded and conquered, which was a kind of colonial rule, was very similar to what the colonial Europeans did, colonial Christians did to the countries they came from. If you remember a couple of years ago, for the Jaipur dialogues, we were supposed to have a debate with me and Shashi Tharoor. He didn't show up at the last minute. But he wrote a brilliant book on the British and how they destroyed India culturally and how they were basically Nazis in what they did, murdering, creating famines, destroying culture, denigrating people, racism of every type. But I asked, why didn't he do that for the Mughal rule of Aurangzeb or for the Delhi Sultanate? And he avoided it, or he said, well, but they stayed. Does that mean that if a group who conquers you, if somebody steals your house and stays there, you should accept the fact that they've stolen your house? Whereas if they steal your house and leave, you have the right to take it back. So that history has to be done. And it's not necessarily specifically an attack on Islam. There are theological issues, of course. The Delhi Sultanate was a particular group. The Turks of different types, Aurangzeb, they were also descendants by some degrees from the Mongols. That's where they got the term Mughal. In fact, the term Khan is a Mongol term and a Turkish term of leadership. It has nothing to do with Islam. It existed before Islam. And the greatest of the Khans was the Genghis Khan. And the other great Khans destroyed Baghdad and also a lot of the Islamic rule. They ruled over. So the history must be put into perspective, particularly in India. In India, you're still getting the colonial view of history. In America, as children, we were taught the Native Americans were bloodthirsty savages who killed the poor white people coming west to establish their farms, raiding their wagon trains. Now we realize they were very gentle souls who the white Christians essentially massacred whenever they got in their way, broke all the treaties. They never broke the treaties. They were totally honest people. They said, white man speaks with a forked tongue. The same things happen in India under a number of the Islamic leaders, not only the ones who came from the outside as invaders, but some of those who stayed in. Aurangzeb was also born in India, but he didn't have an idea of himself as an Indian. He had the idea of a need to Islamicize India according to the type of Islam he followed. And to do this, he had to kill his own brother, who followed a more liberal form of Islam than he did. But even his poor brother Dara, even though Dara came from Sufi traditions, when he was killed by his brother, the Sufis didn't come to support him, or did they even really join him very much in his attempt to fight against the brother. So history has to be set straight. We also have to remember people can change. I always say, please examine and approach each person as an individual. Do not look upon them according to their sex, age, color of skin, or religion. That being said, there are powerful samskaras that religions, philosophies, politics create, and we must recognize their power and their ability to endure if we don't challenge them. So yes, the history of India needs to be rewritten from the ancient period, and the history of the world also. A lot of the slave trade out of Africa was run by the Islamic world, not just simply the Europeans. That came a bit later. So these things must be borne in mind.
Shall we take the next question?
Yes, we should. Hold on a second, though. I think my battery is getting a little bit low.
So friends, I would like to tell you that Dr. David Frawley is a repository of not just knowledge, he's a repository of wisdom, because he is through the experiential school of Raman Maharshi and his followers. So he is from the experiential Raman Maharshi school. He's written a lot of books, You can go to his Amazon page and look over those books. I think there are almost 24 books of deep philosophy explaining these Indian terms, Indian philosophies in a very simple way. And now we have him back here, and so we take up the next question. Okay, this question says that is activating all Kundalini is possible, or is it just a hypothesis?
Well, what we've had, fortunately and unfortunately, is a lot of terms and teachings from the Dharmic traditions and yoga traditions have come to the West and often been misunderstood and caused certain distortions to arise. Yoga becoming asana, tantra becoming sex, all these things. And another term there is kundalini, and it's almost been treated like a electrical force that you can turn on if you do certain techniques. And first of all, I just want to say that we have to look at it with a deeper point of view. And yoga is a matter of a sadhana and awakening a higher consciousness. So what is this Kundalini Shakti overall? Kundalini Shakti is the Chit Shakti of the Jivatma. It is the power of the individual. I hate to use the term soul. I think we should start using the term jiva, the reincarnating entity, which transcends the mind and it transcends the physical personality. A certain portion of that Chit Shakti runs the physical body, but is largely dormant within us at a deeper level. They say it's asleep at the base of the spine. That's not entirely correct. It is asleep in the Muladhara chakra. Chakras are in the subtle body. They interface with certain places around the spine, which are kind of places where their energy can be transmitted, the pranic energy, through the physical body. So in the ordinary person, the consciousness is limited to the mind. The higher Vijnana, Ananda, Sattvic Buddhi is not activated unless there is a sadhana. Prana is just like the mind. It's caught in dualities, attraction, repulsion, moving in different directions, distractions through the senses. So what Kundalini Shakti is the unitary prana and the unitary awareness that arises through sadhana. And that is the result of a great deal of practice. It is not just something that arises in anybody just by pushing a button. So Kundalini has to be understood. Kundalini as Chit Shakti is Devi, is Durga, is Sundari, is Saraswati. If you don't honor that Yoga Shakti, it's not going to work for you. But it is the power of the Devi. It is the power of the Divine Mother. It is not an electrical force for you to use from an egoistic or mental standpoint. So there must be Atmavichara as self-inquiry. There must be Ishvara Pranidhana, or surrender to the divine, in order to activate this force of higher consciousness. And it only comes through this unification of our faculties and energies. There's another great Swami, Swami Vedabharati, who wrote a very nice book on Kundalini, where he discussed that in more detail. He also did a very excellent study of the Yoga Sutras, 4 volumes, 1,000 pages each, going back to primary commentaries. And I should say, from my own standpoint of my studies, is that the last word in the Yoga Sutras is Shakti, Swarupa Pratishta Chitti Shakti. Swarupa Pratishta Chitti Shakti. It ends with that Shakti, which is Chit Shakti, or the power of awareness over all. So that is what we need to arouse, and that comes through the sadhana when we go beyond the mind, go beyond the ego, and cease to identify with the body and the mind. You can use your body and mind as instruments. In fact, they're tremendously wonderful instruments. They're the temple of your expression, but they are not you. They're like your kind of your automobile and your computer. You really need them, but you are not them. So once the yogi has that inner unitary consciousness, then it's possible to use the body and mind in even better ways, but you transcend them. So Kundalini Shakti, Yoga Shakti must be honored for it to work. And it is connected to the Jivatma and to the Paramatma, not to the outer mind or the outer ego. And it requires that we move our awareness within. And we can also see that in the story of Sri Ram. Sri Ram is Paramatma. Lakshman is the Buddhi. Hanuman is the awakened prana. And Sita is also the knowledge of the Atma. Sita is the daughter of Janaka, who was one of the greatest sages of all India and great Advaitin. And so that the Ramayana, the Rama story, is also about that inner awakening the Yoga Shakti to take us to the highest light of Sri Ram and transforming our prana from an outer indulgence in the material world to the servant of the Paramatma, to the great Sri Hanuman.
We have 2 last-minute questions. So we take the first of them. This is All India Muslim Personal Law Board, Hagia Sophia Mosque. Actually, a religious war India is fighting. How do we create awareness regarding this without being Abrahamic in approach?
Yes. Well, first of all, this battle has been going on for centuries in different forms. So you have to see how that has occurred. It was also the basis of the partition of India. And I know of a very great thinker and writer and journalist who was addressing a lot of these issues of history and theology coming out of Islam that has gone on in the modern world. And I'm happy to be sharing the stage with him right now. Sanjay Dixit is very knowledgeable in how these Islamic traditions have created a theology that perpetuates these points of view, and that theology needs to be challenged and changed. He knows the languages involved, the history involved, so that must be done. There's also some diversity in the Islamic world, the Sunni versus Shia. There are people like Tariq Fatah who are more liberal or moving beyond Islam in the ordinary sense. So there are other voices that we can see and understand. There is the global struggle even within not only the Islamic world, but within those people, because you're not born within a religion. A person born in any part of the human world is a human being first. So they're also struggling, and they're also changing and developing over time. And you'll see that Kemal Ataturk did a lot of development to modernize Turkey, and now Erdogan is taking it the other way. And you'll also see that if you went back to the 1970s, whether it's Afghanistan or Iran or Egypt or Syria, that there weren't the burqas. So there's been a movement backwards, but there is resistance to that. So this has to be understood. And the most sad thing is today is that the liberal forces, so-called liberal forces in the West, have embraced the orthodox or the fundamentalist Islam. And they have turned the burqa into a symbol of freedom with an International Burqa Day, rather than the oppression that the Muslim women feel. I have Muslim women friends in Iran, and they're abhorred as appalled because of what they are seeing going on in the West. We have certain Islamic writers, women writers, who are also addressing these issues. But we have to be aware of the greater problems involved and trying to take the dialogue forward and trying to improve the situation so that we have not only political freedom, but we also have spiritual freedom. The Hindu tradition is spiritual pluralism. The West is still following traditions that are dictatorial and hegemonistic, seeking to conquer the world. Conversion-based Christianity and Islam are not pluralistic, and they are out of harmony with the pluralistic society at any level. And at the same time, just having pluralism doesn't mean you don't have any point of view. True pluralism means that you understand there is one transcendent truth behind the different points of view. Not that the different points of view are all the same or all correct, and you have a freedom of discussion and debate and an honoring of inner experience, not just simply the outer experience. That's why we have to have meditation in the schools, concentration in the schools. It's not just enough to learn information or to repeat things, because that makes us blind and that makes us continue the distortions from the past.
Now the last question. Last question is a short one. And I think it requires probably a short answer as well. Is Western development model sustainable for Earth?
Well, has it been sustainable to the Earth so far? Obviously, it's caused a lot of ecological problems, whether it's the pollution of the atmosphere, the pollution of the soils. For example, most of our food depends upon the nutrients in the first 1 to 3 feet of the soil. What is the state of that soil in the world? Not very good. There's not an ecosystem. There's not a part of the atmosphere that hasn't been somehow distorted and polluted. And we do have an excess of all the material development in terms of quantity. I'm not necessarily in terms of quality. So obviously we need a new sustainable approach to civilization. And one of the keys is to move beyond the concept of consumerism and enjoyment as the goal of life. If consumerism is the goal of life, then we are going to consume and destroy the entire world in which we live. And that is what we're doing in many places. So we need some transcendent vision, but that transcendent vision can't be the triumph of only one faith, one God, one book, one prophet, one savior. These are all divisive and exclusive. Monotheism is not unity consciousness. It is singularity and domination of one exclusive group over another. So we need a point of unitary transcendence and harmony. Dharmic traditions provide the keys to how to do that. We need to honor the earth not just as a material resource, but as Bhumi Devi, as conscious, as life, as connected to the universe. We need to honor the self-aware universe, not just simply material resources. We need to honor the individual as having a living prana that we cannot just simply manipulate by giving them lots of drugs or by programming them with lots of data and information. So obviously the current model is not sustainable, and many people know it, and they're seeking to create new forms of sustainability. But overall, we need a very broad view of sustainability. It's nice to do something with farming here and water resources there, but we also need a broader philosophical view of sustainability, which takes us back to the Dharmic ideas of interdependence, unity of human being with nature, or as Upanishads teach, the entire universe dwells within our own hearts. It's not an external thing only. And we have a cosmic duty, not just political human rights. We have a cosmic and universal duty to bring harmony, consciousness, well-being to the entire planet and all living beings, and to become a species that we can be proud of, rather than a species that appears like a planetary predator that needs to be chastised. So let us go back to the views of the great sages all over the world, but particularly the great rishis and yogis of Bharat that are still sustaining that tradition in spite of all the years and centuries of the attempts to destroy it and all the efforts still going on today politically, socially. And within all of that, Ayodhya and Sri Ram and Ram Janmabhoomi has come up again. And that, I think, is a sign of things to come and should be the seed and the foundation, the fountain for a new dharmic humanity. Jai Shri Ram.
On that note, I think we bring this discussion to the end. And on the day that Bhagavan Ram has been honored with the Shilanyas of his temple in the place of his birth, I think it was just appropriate to have had a Jnana Yajna with you. Jnana Yajna, as sometimes it is pronounced. or Jnana Yajna, as we pronounce it in the north mostly. With this Jnana Yajna, I once again salute you, sir, for this wonderful wisdom that you've given us. Jai Shri Ram.
Jai Shri Ram.